Welcome and thank you for being here tonight. Please set your volume to a gentle level, lie down comfortably, close your eyes, and allow the quiet to surround you. Now let us begin drifting into sleep with a slow and uneventful tale. This is the very first story in our Boring History for Sleep series, The Uneventful Birth of the Plow. If this helps you rest, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can join us here every night. In the earliest days of human settlement, before the sweep of history had gathered much momentum, life was measured by the rhythm of the seasons and the stubbornness of the soil beneath one's feet. People had already discovered that seeds, when cast upon the ground, could bring forth life in the form of crops, and that these crops could be stored, shared, and relied upon far more than the unpredictable hunt or the fleeting gathering of wild fruits. Yet, as simple as planting seemed, there remained a problem that was less dramatic than battles and kings, yet more constant than the rising of the sun. The earth was hard. It resisted the hand. It resisted the stick. It resisted almost every crude tool that early people tried to drag across its surface. Scratching the soil with bare hands or with sharpened branches was exhausting, slow, and often yielded little more than frustration. It is here, in this struggle between human will and Earth's resistance, that the story of the plow quietly began. There was no sudden flash of brilliance, no single hero standing tall in history, claiming to have invented it. Instead, there was only the steady observation of countless farmers, nameless in time, who realized that the soil might yield more easily if it were persuaded rather than attacked. The first crude attempts were likely nothing more than a forked branch dragged across the ground, pulled by human arms weary from effort. This simple dragging loosened the soil, breaking its crust and allowing the seed to slip beneath the surface. Though primitive, it was enough to hint that greater harvest might be possible if the land were prepared more thoroughly. The change did not come overnight, for no innovation in those days ever did. People clung to what was familiar, repeating the rituals of planting and waiting, often suspicious of anything too new. Yet slowly, as generations passed, the idea of fashioning stronger and heavier tools out of wood became more common. The earth demanded strength, and human shoulders were not enough, so the thought turned to animals. Oxen, already domesticated for their milk and strength, seemed the natural partners. When the forked stick was tied to their harness and dragged across the field, the furrows cut deeper, straighter, and with far less human effort. This was not the dramatic clash of civilizations or the rise of empires. It was quiet, slow, and almost unremarkable, yet it reshaped the destiny of humanity in ways that the people of that time could not possibly have understood. By turning soil more effectively, by preparing the earth for seed, the plow expanded what fields could yield. Communities could grow larger, food could be stored through leaner seasons, and a sense of stability began to take root. Villages could remain in one place. Traditions could deepen, and children could be raised with the expectation that the harvest would return each year. The plow was not a machine of beauty or of grandeur. It was rough wood, often breaking under strain, needing constant repair, and demanding patience. It did not shine in the sun like a sword, nor command admiration like a temple. It was simply there, dragged across the dirt, squeaking, groaning, splitting the ground, and yet, in its uneventful birth, it gave rise to abundance. The story of the plow is not a tale of one great moment, but rather of many small ones, repeated endlessly until they became the new normal. The uneventful became transformative. The ordinary became extraordinary in its impact. That is why tonight, as you listen and drift further into rest, we begin not with a grand battle or a mighty king, but with the humble beginnings of a tool so simple that it is easy to overlook, and yet so vital that without it, the story of civilization itself would have been far shorter. As the centuries unfolded, the plow began to spread quietly across regions, carried not by armies or merchants of luxury, but by farmers moving from one valley to the next, by families seeking more fertile land, by whispers of a tool that could make the stubborn ground just a little more yielding. At first, these early plows were nothing more than heavy wooden beams with sharpened ends, pulled clumsily by oxen whose slow strength was better suited to the task than human shoulders could ever be. The soil, once scratched in shallow lines, was now turned deeper, exposing the darker, richer earth beneath the surface crust. For the farmer, this meant that the seed could take hold more securely, shielded from wind and birds. and able to drink from the hidden moisture stored below. It was not a revolution in the noisy sense of drums and banners, but it was a revolution of patience, repeated with each planting season, until it became impossible to imagine sowing without it. Imagine the field stretching wide under the sky, a man guiding his oxen with steady hands, the plow dragging slowly behind, carving a line through the earth that would, in time, feed his family through the winter. The sound was not heroic, only the steady creak of wood, the grunt of animals, the sigh of soil being torn open. Yet in that sound lay the promise of survival. It is easy for us now, looking back, to underestimate the quiet magnitude of this change. Without the plow, villages would have remained small, crops unreliable, hunger a constant companion. With it, surpluses could be stored, shared, and even traded. And where there is surplus, there is time. Time to think, time to build, time to shape communities into something more complex than mere survival. In this way, the plow, uncelebrated though it was, laid the groundwork for culture, for trade, for stories, for everything that grows when the stomach is not empty. But the path of the plow was not without its difficulties. The wooden tips wore down quickly, splintering against stones, bending in stubborn clay. Farmers became carpenters out of necessity, repairing and reshaping their tools, learning which types of wood could endure longest, which shapes cut most cleanly. Over time, some realized that fastening bits of harder material, stone or eventually bronze, could extend the life of their plows, though at greater cost. Each improvement was modest, hardly noticed in the sweep of generations. Yet together they shaped a tool that became more efficient, more reliable, and more central to daily life. Communities began to recognize that owning oxen was no small matter, for with animals came the power to cultivate larger plots, to feed more mouths, to trade more widely. Land that had once been dismissed as too stubborn for planting could now be broken open, drawn into the circle of fields, expanding the boundaries of what was possible. Slowly, this shifted the very structure of societies. Families who had oxen prospered. Those who did not often relied on borrowing or sharing. And thus social hierarchies began to form around a tool that itself bore no grandeur. The plow did not sparkle, it did not intimidate, it simply worked. And in its quiet working, it redrew the lines of human settlement. There were no songs sung for it, no great legends carved into stone to celebrate its invention. Instead, it was woven silently into the background of life, so essential that it was almost invisible, like the air one breathes. And perhaps that is why its story feels so uneventful, for it did not announce itself with drama. It did not demand attention. It simply appeared, and in appearing, it changed the way humanity met the earth. Tonight, as you let your body rest and your mind wander, think of those countless nameless farmers whose hands guided oxen, whose sweat fell upon the soil, who never knew that in their humble labor they were shaping the destiny of generations yet unborn. They did not dream of history or glory. They dreamed only of bread, of safety, of another season carried through. And from those simple dreams, carried in furrows across the earth, civilization slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to grow. The story of the plow continues not with sudden leaps, but with gradual refinements, each one so modest that it might have seemed forgettable at the time, yet each one carrying with it the weight of progress. As bronze spread across early societies, some farmers realized that attaching small bronze tips to their wooden plows could extend their strength and durability. These metal edges were costly, not every family could afford them, but where they appeared the results were obvious: deeper furrows, smoother cuts, fewer breaks during the labor of spring. A farmer with such a tool could till more land in less time, meaning more seed could be planted and more harvest gathered. The difference between wood and bronze was not glamorous, yet it marked another step in the long, uneventful birth of an idea that was slowly reshaping human destiny. The oxen plodded on, steady and patient, and behind them walked men and women who had no idea they were building the foundation for cities, markets, and trade routes that would one day span continents. With the plow, societies could move beyond the fragile existence of subsistence. Villages grew larger, walls began to rise, storage pits and granaries appeared. People could afford to keep records, to carve simple symbols to count grain, to assign value to trade. In time, those records became writing, and those trades became networks stretching across rivers and deserts. All of this, though, rested on the ability to grow more than one family could eat. And that ability rested on the shoulders of the plow. Still, the plow was far from perfect. Wooden frames bent under strain, bronze tips dulled against rocks, and the oxen themselves often faltered under the endless dragging. Farmers had to walk patiently behind, guiding, repairing, coaxing the animals forward with quiet words or sharp prods. The work was slow, repetitive, and exhausting. Yet in that very repetition lay its power, for the earth, once broken in straight lines, could be planted evenly, harvested efficiently, and replanted again and again. Generation after generation repeated this task until the act itself became a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. Children watched their fathers guide the plow, and in time they too took the handles, continuing the cycle. What had once been innovation became tradition, and tradition hardened into necessity. As iron spread across the ancient world, the plow transformed once again. Iron, harder and more durable than bronze, allowed for stronger blades that could cut into heavier soils that had long resisted cultivation. Entire regions that had been left wild now yielded to the farmer's touch. The plains, once thought too stubborn, became fields of grain. With each step, the quiet reach of the plow expanded, and with it expanded the possibility of larger communities, more complex hierarchies, and deeper cultural roots. Yet for all its importance, the plow never became an object of wonder. No traveler stopped in awe at the sight of it. It was not displayed in temples or carried into battle as a symbol of might. It remained in the background, its creak and groan a familiar song of labor. And perhaps that is why its history feels uneventful, because it was always there, always working, never demanding attention. But in truth, this uneventful story is the very story of humanity's shift from survival to stability. Without the plow, the granaries would be empty, the markets silent, the villages abandoned. With it, there was food to store, food to share, food to trade, and from that simple abundance sprang the chance to dream of more than the next meal. As you imagine those endless furrows stretching across the earth, picture the hands that guided them, rough and calloused, yet steady. Picture the oxen straining forward. Picture the soil turning dark and rich. Picture the seeds dropping into place with quiet hope. That picture is not filled with excitement or spectacle, yet it is the picture upon which everything else rests. Tonight, as you drift deeper into rest, let that picture carry you gently, for in its steady rhythm lies the calm heartbeat of history itself. As iron plows became more common, the rhythm of life across many ancient regions began to change in ways that were subtle but enduring. The fields that once resisted cultivation now yielded more willingly, and with every season the furrows grew longer and the harvest more dependable. Farmers began to think not only of survival from one year to the next, but also of surplus, of trade, and of storing grain for leaner times. The presence of granaries meant that food could be kept beyond the immediate season, and with that security came the opportunity to invest time in other pursuits. Villages expanded into towns, towns into small cities, and within their walls, people found themselves able to dedicate energy to crafts, rituals, and forms of organization beyond farming. Yet all of this grandeur rested on the quiet scraping of a plow through the soil. The invention did not spread like wildfire, but rather like a creeping vine, slow and steady, reaching from one community to the next as knowledge was shared along paths of trade and migration. Some regions adapted the plow differently, designing it to suit their particular landscapes. In fertile river valleys, light plows were enough, but in heavier soils, farther north and west, stronger frames and sharper blades were required. Farmers experimented endlessly, changing angles, weights, and shapes, not in laboratories or workshops, but in fields under the open sky, guided only by observation and patience. The story of these refinements was never written down in detail, for no one thought them remarkable at the time. But centuries later, the effect was plain: more food, larger populations, and the stability that allowed cultures to flourish. The plow also changed relationships between people and the land. Fields once thought untamable were now pulled into use, forests cleared, and meadows converted into farmland. This expansion meant that landscapes were altered, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly, as human ambition pressed further into the natural world. Families with access to strong animals and durable plows prospered, while those without were left behind, creating quiet hierarchies that shaped early societies. In this way, the plow did not only carve the soil, it carved lines of wealth and power as well. The oxen, slow and steady, became indispensable, and their presence in a village was a sign of stability. A household that could maintain such animals and the tools to guide them stood at an advantage. And so the plow, though humble, became a silent measure of status. Still, to the people using it, the tool remained an everyday object. They did not pause to marvel at its significance. They simply yoked their animals, pressed the wooden handles, and guided the blade across the soil, repeating the motion day after day, year after year. Its uneventful birth faded into uneventful use, and in that quiet routine lay the groundwork of civilizations. As iron gave way to steel in later centuries, the plow would evolve further, becoming sharper, stronger, and capable of cutting even deeper into the earth. But for now, in these early days, the iron plow stood as a modest but transformative partner to human labor. No chronicles celebrated it, no poets sang of it, and yet it carried more weight for the survival of communities than most rulers or warriors of its age. And so, as you lie in silence and let your body sink deeper into rest, think of those furrows stretching endlessly across the horizon, each one a quiet promise that life would continue. The uneventful scrape of metal through earth, repeated again and again, was the unseen heartbeat of early society, steady and calm, reminding us that history is not always made by sudden events, but often by the slow, unnoticed tools that shape daily existence. As the centuries moved forward and iron plows became a familiar presence, the very rhythm of human life began to take on new layers of predictability. Communities that once lived in constant uncertainty now had a tool that anchored their relationship with the land, giving them confidence that their labor would yield food more consistently. The simple act of cutting deeper furrows into the earth had consequences that reached far beyond the field itself. Surplus food meant larger families could be supported, and larger families meant more hands to work, defend, and build. Villages that might once have remained small clusters of huts began to sprawl outward, with paths turning into roads and gatherings turning into markets. With more food stored, people could travel farther without fear of starvation. And from those travels came exchanges of ideas, languages, and traditions. All of this unfolded slowly, uneventfully, one planting season at a time, until entire regions bore the quiet mark of the plow's presence. Farmers in different lands adapted the tool to their own needs. In some places, lighter plows were ideal for sandy soils, gliding through the ground with little resistance, while in heavier clay regions, stronger frames and sharper blades were needed. Iron-tipped plows cut into stubborn earth, turning what had once been dismissed as unworkable into fertile ground, ready to yield grain. Each variation spoke not of invention in the grand sense, but of adaptation, of countless small adjustments made by nameless individuals whose only concern was coaxing life from the soil. The plow had no inventor celebrated in stories, for its birth was not sudden and its growth was not dramatic. Instead, it belonged to everyone who guided it, repaired it, or leaned their weight upon its handle, hoping that this year the earth would be generous. And though they never thought of themselves as shaping history, that is precisely what they were doing. With fields expanding, granaries filling, and trade routes forming, human societies became more complex. People could afford to specialize, some focusing on pottery, others on weaving, others on metalwork. Temples rose, rituals deepened, and with time, written records became more common, marking the growth of administration and order. Yet beneath all of this, there remained the quiet certainty that when spring returned, the plow would be guided once more, furrows would open, and seeds would fall into place. It is almost poetic that such an unremarkable tool carried so much weight, for it demonstrates how history often rests, not on single dramatic acts, but on repetitive gestures carried out across generations. The steady scrape of iron against earth, the slow stride of oxen, the sweat on a farmer's brow, all of these created the foundation for kingdoms, for trade, for culture. And yet to those who lived it, nothing seemed extraordinary. It was just another day, another season, another harvest to hope for. Tonight, as you let your body sink further into calm, imagine that field stretching wide beneath the open sky, a figure guiding a plow behind oxen. the line in the soil growing longer and straighter with each step. There is no drama, no spectacle, only the rhythm of labor and the promise of food. This is the heart of the plow's uneventful birth, and it is in that very uneventfulness that we find its true significance. The quiet journey of the plow carried on into later centuries, weaving itself so deeply into daily life that people almost forgot it had ever been new. By this stage, entire landscapes bore the mark of its steady passage. Where forests had once stood, fields stretched in orderly rows. Where grasslands had been left untouched, furrows now divided the soil into neat patterns ready for planting. The plow had become so common that no one thought to remark upon it, yet its presence was the hidden engine behind the rise of complex societies. In regions where populations grew dense, the plow's efficiency meant more mouths could be fed with less human effort, and this freed certain members of society from farming altogether. Those freed hands became artisans, builders, scribes, and traders. What appears in history books as the sudden flourishing of culture was in truth supported quietly by the humble scraping of wood and iron through earth. The plow was never seen as a symbol of power in the way a sword or a crown was, yet it enabled both. Armies marched on grain, kings ruled over populations that could only gather in such numbers because fields had been expanded and harvests had been secured. Without the plow, the very structure of kingdoms and empires would have collapsed. Still, to the farmer behind the oxen, none of this mattered. He did not think of empires. He thought of bread, of keeping his children warm through the winter, of coaxing one more furrow from tired soil. The routine was always the same. Harness the oxen, press the handle, and guide the blade as it cut into the earth. Step by step, line by line, the field was open to life once more. The tool itself remained simple, yet even simplicity carried within it endless refinements. Handles were reshaped for better grip, blades were angled for smoother cutting, frames were strengthened to withstand greater strain. Each small improvement went unnoticed by the wider world, but together they made the work easier, faster, more reliable. The plow became not just a tool, but a quiet companion, present in every season, binding human effort to the rhythms of nature. Its story remained uneventful because it never announced itself with sudden change. Instead, it worked silently, like the slow growth of a tree or the steady flow of a river, shaping the world not by force, but by persistence. As centuries passed, new materials and designs would continue to appear, but the essence remained unchanged. A blade drawn across soil to prepare the way for seed. That essence is what carried humanity from fragile beginnings to the threshold of civilization. Tonight, as you let your breathing slow, imagine that endless repetition, season after season, year after year. Picture the plow moving steadily forward, the soil parting with a sigh, the seeds waiting to be sown. There is no rush, no noise, only the calm rhythm of labor that has endured for thousands of years. In its uneventful birth and uneventful use, the plow became the quiet foundation upon which human life has always rested. By the time the plow had become a fixture of nearly every agricultural society, it no longer felt like an invention at all, but rather a fact of life, as ordinary as the rising sun or the turning of seasons. Its presence was assumed, its importance unnoticed, yet the quiet scrape of its blade through soil continued to shape the course of human history. In villages and towns, the rhythm of life was now marked by the cycles of planting and harvesting, cycles made possible by the plow's efficiency. Fields stretched wider, granaries grew fuller, and populations became more stable, paving the way for institutions, laws, and organized communities. Without realizing it, humanity had stepped firmly into a new era, not because of kings or conquerors, but because of an unremarkable tool that allowed the soil to yield more than ever before. Farmers of these times were rarely celebrated. They did not carve their names into monuments or leave behind records of their daily labor. Yet it was their hands guiding the plow, their sweat darkening the soil, that made the survival of entire communities possible. Every furrow they carved was a silent promise that their children would eat, that their neighbors would trade, that their villages would thrive. And while stories of heroes and battles filled the oral traditions of many cultures, the true hero was often the quiet ox, trudging forward, and the plow dragging behind, turning earth into life. Slowly, as techniques spread, different regions adapted the plow even further. In wet, marshy lands, lighter designs allowed the tool to float more easily without sinking. In drier, rocky regions, heavier iron blades were forged to break through stubborn ground. The knowledge of how to use and build plows became as essential as knowing how to sow seeds or bake bread. Children grew up watching their elders guide the plow, and by the time they could walk steadily, they too took turns holding the handles, learning the rhythm of steps that would sustain them for life. It was not an exciting lesson, nor was it filled with surprises, but it was one of the most important skills a person could acquire in those days. This universality gave the plow a strange kind of quiet power. Though unnoticed, it unified communities across vast distances. For whether in a distant valley or along a winding river, the sight of a plow being drawn across a field was familiar to all. It represented continuity, survival, and the steady march of life. And yet, in its uneventful way, the plow also deepened humanity's bond with the land. By allowing more fields to be worked, more forests were cleared, more grasslands transformed into farmland, altering ecosystems that had existed for millennia. This was not done with malice or grandeur, but simply with the persistence of survival, each family seeking enough food for another year. Slowly, this reshaping of the land became one of the most lasting legacies of the plow. Even now, if one were to travel across ancient landscapes, the traces of those early furrows can still sometimes be found beneath layers of time, subtle reminders of humanity's first steady conversation with the soil. As you rest tonight and let your mind drift, imagine that endless continuity, the same action repeated by countless generations, nameless yet united by the common need to till the earth. There is no drama in this image, only calm persistence, the kind of persistence that built civilizations without ever drawing attention to itself. The plow's story remains uneventful, and that is precisely why it is so powerful, for it shows that history's foundations are often laid not in moments of excitement, but in the steady, quiet labors that endure through centuries. As generations continued their steady reliance on the plow, the tool itself became so deeply woven into the background of daily existence that people rarely paused to think of it as an invention at all. It was simply there, as ordinary as the morning dew on the fields, or the evening smoke rising from hearths. And yet, while unnoticed, the plow continued to shape the very structure of human society. With more fertile ground under cultivation, populations grew denser, villages expanded, and trade networks stretched farther. The surplus created by plowed fields allowed for the growth of towns where not everyone needed to farm. Specialists emerged, craftsmen, scribes, builders, priests, and each layer of complexity was supported by the unseen labor of furrows being drawn across the soil. The plow became a silent partner in every loaf of bread, every vessel of beer, every gathering around a communal meal. In this way, a tool that made no noise beyond the creak of wood and the grunt of oxen was quietly giving birth to culture itself. Yet the work was not without hardship. Soil resisted, weather shifted, and each season carried risks of flood, drought, or blight. The plow was no magic wand. It did not guarantee abundance, but it gave farmers a stronger chance. Each spring, the handles were gripped once more, the blade pressed into the earth, and the hope for survival renewed itself. The uneventful repetition of this act became the most dependable rhythm of early life, a rhythm so constant that entire calendars, rituals, and festivals were built around it. Communities prayed for rain, for fertile ground, for the strength of their oxen, but they knew that none of these prayers meant anything without the simple dragging of a plow to prepare the soil. In many regions, the plow even entered into local stories and symbols, not as a heroic object, but as a mark of endurance and diligence. Some myths spoke of gods teaching humans to guide the plow, while others wove it into tales of creation, where earth was split open to allow life to emerge. Though these stories often blurred the line between myth and memory, they revealed a deep truth, that people understood, at least in their own way, how central this tool was to their survival. Still, the plow's history was never dramatic. No wars were fought over it, no monuments built to honor it. It was simply part of the landscape, unnoticed but indispensable. And perhaps that is why its story feels so calm, for it reminds us that civilization was not built only by extraordinary events, but by countless ordinary gestures. The plow, in its uneventful birth, carried humanity forward, not through noise, but through silence, not through sudden change, but through endless repetition. As you drift deeper into rest tonight, imagine once more the quiet scene of a farmer guiding oxen across a wide plain, the sun low on the horizon, the soil turning dark and rich behind the blade. The air is filled not with drama, but with patience, not with spectacle, but with calm persistence. That scene, repeated millions of times across centuries, is the true heartbeat of human progress. It is uneventful, yes, but in its uneventfulness lies the deepest kind of history, the history of survival, stability, and the slow unfolding of civilization. By the time centuries had turned into millennia, the plow was no longer seen as something that had ever been invented, but rather as something that had always been, like the river flowing through the valley or the sun that rose without fail. Its slow and steady evolution had been absorbed into the fabric of life, and while empires rose and fell with noise and violence, the plow remained unchanged in its quiet duty. Every field that was sown, every harvest that was gathered, every loaf that filled a table, carried within it the silent trace of the plow's passage. It had no glory attached to it, no heroes claiming its design, no rulers boasting of its power, and yet its contribution was greater than any battle won or palace built. With the plow, larger fields could be cultivated, and with those fields came surpluses that allowed cities to expand. In those cities, administrators wrote laws, priests held ceremonies, and craftsmen shaped beauty into stone and clay. None of that would have been possible if the fields had not been prepared, season after season, by farmers guiding oxen across the soil. And so, though unseen, the plow is present in every ritual, every market, every story told by the firelight. Its uneventful work carried within it the possibility of all human creativity. Yet the work of guiding a plow was never easy. The soil fought back, stones caught the blade, and rain or drought could undo months of labor. The oxen strained and groaned, the wooden frames cracked under pressure, and repairs were constant. But even with these frustrations, the plow remained worth the effort, for without it, the earth was less generous. It was persistence, not perfection, that gave the tool its value. The farmers knew this, though they did not speak of it in grand words. They only rose each morning, harnessed their animals, pressed the blade to the ground, and walked slowly forward, carving another line into the soil. That was enough. Over time, the plow's very ordinariness became its strength. It was not a miracle that came once and vanished, but a tool that returned year after year, carrying with it the memory of generations. Grandchildren guided the same fields where their grandparents had walked, and the rhythm of furrows became a thread linking the past to the present. In this way, the plow created not just food, but continuity, a sense that life would endure through repetition. And in that endurance, communities found stability, even comfort. The plow was uneventful, but uneventfulness itself was a kind of gift. It allowed human beings to trust in tomorrow, to believe that the cycle of planting and harvest would not fail, to build families and traditions around that trust. Tonight, as you let your body fall deeper into stillness, imagine once more the endless lines stretching across the earth, the oxen moving steadily, the soil parting with calm obedience. It is not exciting, it is not dramatic, but it is lasting. The plow's uneventful journey reminds us that history is not only made in sudden moments of brilliance or chaos, but also in the patient repetition of tasks so ordinary that they almost disappear from memory. And yet, it is those very tasks that sustain everything else. As the story of the plow reaches its quiet conclusion, it is important to remember that its uneventful nature is precisely what gave it strength. Unlike inventions that announced themselves with fanfare or moments of sudden brilliance, the plow crept into human life without spectacle. It was born in obscurity, shaped slowly by countless hands, tested in soil that resisted, and improved across generations that asked for nothing more than enough food to survive another year. And yet, by doing nothing more than guiding a blade through earth, humanity gave itself the stability to dream beyond survival. From that simple act of turning soil came the surpluses that filled granaries, the markets that fostered trade, the cities that gathered people together, and the cultures that grew from shared rituals and traditions. The plow did not conquer, but it allowed conquering armies to march on full stomachs. It did not write laws, but it gave administrators a stable society in which laws could be enforced. It did not carve monuments, but it gave builders the time and resources to imagine them. In this way, the plow was never celebrated, but always essential. It stood in the background, silent and steady, its uneventful rhythm the heartbeat beneath civilization's louder voices. The farmers who held its handles never thought of themselves as shaping history. They thought only of their families, of the food they hoped to gather, of the chance to endure another winter. Their world was small, measured in furrows and seasons, yet unknowingly they carried the weight of the future. Each step behind an ox, each furrow carved into soil, was a thread in the vast tapestry of human progress. And so the plow became more than a tool. It became continuity itself. Its story was not of invention, but of persistence. Not of brilliance, but of patience. Not of sudden triumph, but of steady repetition. That is why the history of the plow is best described as uneventful, because it was never about moments, but about centuries. Never about individuals, but about communities. Never about glory, but about survival. And in that survival lay the seed of everything that followed. Tonight, as you allow your thoughts to drift into stillness, imagine that long, unbroken chain of people guiding the plow across the earth, generation after generation, nameless but united by the same need. Imagine the soil turning dark beneath the blade, the seeds falling into place, the quiet hope renewed with each season. It is not a story of heroes, but it is the story of us all. The uneventful birth of the plow reminds us that the greatest changes in human history often come not through noise and spectacle, but through the calm persistence of ordinary labor repeated without end. And in that thought there is peace, a peace that stretches as wide and steady as the furrows themselves, carrying you now into a deep and restful sleep. And that is the end of our story. Before we move on to the next one, please give this video a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Now, let us continue our boring history for sleep series and drift into the next tale, the windmills of medieval Europe. When we think of the medieval landscape, our minds often fill with images of castles rising above stone walls, of knights clad in armor, of monasteries tucked quietly into valleys. Yet scattered across those same landscapes was another presence, far less celebrated in songs or stories, but just as important to the lives of ordinary people, the windmill. Its sails stretched wide against the sky, turning steadily in the breeze, not for glory, not for war, but for the simple work of grinding grain into flour. The birth of the windmill in Europe was neither sudden nor dramatic. Like many tools that shaped human history, it arrived quietly, borrowed and adapted from earlier designs seen in the East. By the 12th century, windmills were appearing in England, France, and the Low Countries, blending themselves into the rhythm of rural life. To the villagers who lived beneath their slow-turning blades, they were both mysterious and ordinary. Mysterious because the great arms seemed to turn of their own will, creaking with the power of invisible air. Ordinary because they soon became part of the background, their steady labor feeding households, monasteries, and marketplaces alike. Before the arrival of windmills, the grinding of grain was done by hand or with animal-powered mills. Women bent over querns, turning stones by sheer strength, hour after hour, to produce enough flour for a single meal. It was exhausting, repetitive labor, often falling on the shoulders of those who already carried countless other burdens of daily survival. The watermill had already begun to ease this burden in many regions, but water was not always near, and rivers could not be bent to every need. The wind, however, was everywhere, and so the idea of harnessing it, of letting invisible air take the place of aching muscles, spread quickly. The first European windmills were post mills, simple wooden structures mounted on a central post that allowed the entire body of the mill to turn so its sails could face the wind. Crude by later standards, these early mills nevertheless transformed rural life. A single mill could grind far more grain than a dozen families working by hand. And so villages began to gather around them, and lords began to claim rights to their operation. To grind one's wheat was no longer a purely household task, but one that tied people more firmly to their communities and to the systems of authority that governed them. Slowly, the sight of turning sails became a mark of prosperity, a reassurance that the community was provided for, and that the endless labor of grinding had at last been shifted from human backs to the ceaseless energy of the wind. Yet the windmill, like the plow before it, was not a tool of spectacle. It made no noise beyond the groaning of wood, the whir of gears, the grinding of stones. Its work was repetitive, its presence constant, and in that constancy lay its value. Farmers brought their grain, millers tended the stones, flour poured forth, and bread was baked. Each step in the chain was uneventful, yet together they formed the foundation of survival. Over time, improvements were made. Stronger sails were built, gear systems refined, and larger stones set to grind more efficiently. What began as simple structures of wood evolved into sturdier mills of stone and brick, landmarks in their own right upon the open plains. Still, their purpose never strayed far from the ordinary, to turn grain into flour, to transform labor into sustenance. Tonight, as you let your breathing slow, imagine the medieval village where one of these early windmills stood. Picture the sails turning lazily against a pale sky, the wooden beams creaking, the smell of freshly ground grain drifting into the air. It is not a dramatic scene, not one of battle or legend, but one of quiet persistence, where the invisible wind becomes bread on the table, and uneventful labor becomes the heartbeat of daily life. The quiet expansion of windmills across medieval Europe was not marked by great declarations or sudden revolutions, but by the slow, steady acceptance of a tool that simply made life easier. In village after village, lords and monasteries invested in mills, seeing them not as symbols of glory, but as reliable engines of productivity. The post mill, with its body mounted on a single upright post, remained the dominant design for many years. To change the direction of the sails, the entire structure was rotated by hand, a process that required strength and patience, yet was still far easier than the endless turning of cornstones inside the home. Soon, the hum of gears and the grinding of millstones became familiar sounds in rural landscapes, as ordinary as the lowing of cattle or the tolling of church bells. For the villagers, the windmill was both a blessing and a bond. It freed them from hours of exhausting hand grinding, yet it also placed them under obligations to the miller or the lord who owned the mill. Grain was often taxed through the mill, with a portion of each sack taken as payment for its use. This quiet intertwining of technology and authority shaped medieval society in subtle ways. The windmill was not only a tool, but also a reminder of hierarchy, a symbol of how even the invisible wind could be drawn into the structures of power. Still, for ordinary families, the benefits outweighed the burdens. Bread was more plentiful, flour finer, and time could be spent on other tasks. Women especially felt the difference, for the drudgery of hand grinding had long fallen to them. With mills handling the bulk of the work, their labor was lightened, though never erased, and villages could redirect their energy toward weaving, dairying, or tending gardens. In this way, the windmill's impact spread quietly into every corner of daily life. As the 13th century progressed, new designs emerged. Tower mills, sturdier and more efficient, began to appear. Unlike the wooden post mills, these were built with fixed stone towers, with only the cap at the top rotating to face the sails into the wind. These mills stood like watchtowers over the countryside, their sails sweeping majestically against the sky. Though they still performed the same humble work of grinding grain, their presence was more enduring, their stone walls less vulnerable to fire and decay. To travelers approaching a village, the sight of a tower mill meant stability and prosperity, a community rooted in the rhythm of agriculture and supported by the steady gift of the wind. Yet the work inside remained uneventful. The miller tended the gears, adjusted the stones, and listened for the sound of grinding that told him the flour was coming evenly. Dust coated the beams, flour clung to clothing, and the air carried the constant vibration of motion. It was repetitive, ordinary, and entirely essential. Without these mills, the bread that sustained life could not have been produced in such abundance. And so the windmill, though rarely praised, became one of the silent engines of medieval Europe. Tonight, as you let yourself relax and drift further into rest, imagine the turning sails of a tower mill on a hilltop, creaking steadily in the breeze. Picture villagers bringing sacks of grain on carts, waiting patiently as the stones grind it to flour. The scene is calm, predictable, without drama. Yet it contains the essence of survival. The wind moves unseen, the sails turn, the stones grind, and bread finds its way to the table. This is the uneventful story of the windmill, a story not of spectacle but of persistence. the kind of story that underlies every civilization. As the centuries advanced, windmills settled more firmly into the background of European life, becoming so common in certain regions that their turning sails became as familiar as the fields they overlooked. By the 14th century, the spread of tower mills marked a quiet evolution in both design and endurance. These new structures, built of stone or brick, stood sturdier against storms and fire, their tall forms casting long shadows across the villages that depended on them. The cap at the top could be turned with a wooden wheel or winch, aligning the sails with the wind's direction, while the heavy millstones inside ground grain with greater consistency than earlier designs. Still, the daily rhythm of the mill remained uneventful. Villagers arrived with sacks of wheat or rye, waiting as the miller tended the gears and stones. Payment was collected not in coins but in kind, with a portion of each sack kept for the lord or the monastery that owned the mill. This arrangement bound peasants not only to the land, but also to the institutions that controlled the mills, making windmills both a practical tool and a quiet symbol of authority. Yet to the ordinary people who relied on them, the mills were simply a necessity. Without them, the burden of hand grinding would return, and so any frustration with dues or taxes was balanced by gratitude for the relief they provided. The atmosphere inside a medieval windmill was unlike anything else in the village. The constant groan of wooden gears, the rhythmic turning of millstones, and the hiss of flour dust in the air created a world both noisy and strangely soothing. For the miller, it was a life of routine, checking the stones, clearing jams, repairing worn timbers. It was not glamorous work, and yet it made him one of the most important figures in his community, for the flour he produced fed every household. Stories and superstitions soon grew around millers, casting them sometimes as cunning, sometimes as greedy, but always as essential. In truth, their work was rarely dramatic. It was endless maintenance, endless grinding, endless patience with a tool that depended on winds that might falter without warning. If the breeze slowed, the sails stopped, and the work was delayed. If the wind blew too fiercely, the mill could be damaged, and safety demanded care. In this way, the windmill taught its keepers a lesson in humility. Human labor could be organized and improved, but it still relied on forces of nature that could not be commanded. And yet, when the balance was right, the turning sails became a symbol of quiet partnership between people and the unseen energy of the wind. Across the Low Countries and the wide fields of northern France, whole landscapes became dotted with these mills, their sails visible from miles away. Travelers noted them not as marvels, but as landmarks, signs of prosperous villages where bread would be abundant. No songs were written about them, no great chronicles recorded their stories, yet their influence was felt in every loaf baked and every meal shared. Tonight, as you let your body sink deeper into calm, picture one of these tower mills standing against a gray medieval sky. Imagine its sails turning slowly, the stones grinding steadily, villagers waiting in patient silence with their grain. The scene is uneventful, perhaps even dull, yet within it lies the foundation of daily survival. The wind blows unseen, the sails obey, and flour fills the sacks. In this quiet rhythm, life continues, proving once more that history is built not only in moments of spectacle, but in the ordinary persistence of tools like the windmill. As windmills became more widespread across medieval Europe, they began to reshape not only the physical landscape, but also the social rhythms of the communities that depended on them. By the late Middle Ages, entire regions, especially the Low Countries and parts of England, had fields punctuated by the turning sails of mills. They stood on ridges and open plains, carefully placed where breezes were strongest, their arms sweeping steadily in circles against the sky. To villagers, the sight was both ordinary and reassuring, for it meant that grain would be ground into flour and that bread would be available to carry them through seasons of hunger and plenty alike. The daily use of windmills was rarely dramatic. Farmers brought their grain in carts or on foot, waited as it was measured, and watched the miller hoist the sacks into the grinding chamber. Inside, the air was thick with flour dust. Wooden gears creaked and groaned, and the rhythmic grind of stone upon stone filled the space with a constant vibration. The miller, often seen as a figure of some mystery, managed the delicate balance between the power of the wind and the strength of the machinery. He adjusted gears, checked stones, and collected dues in the form of grain, always ensuring that the Lord's portion was taken before the flour was returned to its owner. For villagers, this arrangement was simply part of life, accepted without question, for the alternative was returning to the exhausting labor of hand grinding. The windmill, then, was both a symbol of relief and of authority, a reminder that even the air could be harnessed under the structures of feudal society. Yet the work itself remained uneventful. The sails turned, the stones ground, and flour collected in sacks. Day after day, season after season, the process repeated with little change. And yet in this repetition lay the quiet transformation of society. By relieving households of hours of manual labor, windmills gave time back to communities, time that could be used for weaving cloth, tending animals, raising children, or even moments of rest. In this sense, the windmills shaped not only the economy, but the texture of daily existence. It altered how families spent their time, how villages organized themselves, and how communities understood their dependence on forces beyond their control. The reliance on the wind taught patience and humility. A still day meant the sails would not turn, and grain would remain unground. A violent storm meant danger, for the power of the wind, if unchecked, could damage or even destroy the mill. Thus, the windmill was a reminder of human ingenuity, but also of human limits. People could build structures to capture the breeze, but they could not command the wind itself. This balance between mastery and dependence became a quiet lesson that echoed through medieval life. And so, while castles and battles filled the chronicles, the slow turning of windmill sails filled the lives of ordinary people. It was not heroic, not dramatic, and rarely remembered in detail, yet it was essential. Without it, the bread that sustained households, monasteries, and armies alike would have been far harder to produce. Tonight, as you rest, imagine a medieval village where the sun sets behind the broad sails of a tower mill. The air hums with the sound of grinding, and villagers gather their flour in simple cloth sacks. The scene is calm, repetitive, uneventful, and yet it is precisely this uneventfulness that carried generations forward. The windmill's story is not one of spectacle, but of persistence, a reminder that history is built just as much by quiet, ordinary tools as by the grand events that dominate our memory. By the 15th century, windmills had become such a familiar presence across parts of Europe that they almost seemed to belong to the landscape itself, their sails rising above fields and villages like trees rooted not in soil, but in air. The steady turning of those sails was no longer viewed as strange or new, but as a dependable rhythm of rural life, as ordinary as the toll of a church bell or the crowing of a rooster at dawn. People did not marvel at them, but relied upon them, for they were the quiet engines that transformed grain into flour, easing a burden that had once consumed endless hours of human effort. Inside a mill, life unfolded with little variation. The miller measured grain carefully, hoisting heavy sacks into place, adjusting the gearing to make sure the millstones turned at the right speed. Too fast and the flour would burn, too slow and the process would drag on, wasting both time and wind. The creaking of wooden gears mixed with the steady grind of stone on stone, a noise that filled the chamber from dawn until dusk, accompanied always by the fine dust of flour that coated beams, clothes, and skin. The miller's work was repetitive and uneventful, yet it carried the weight of entire communities, for without flour there could be no bread, and without bread there could be no survival. In many villages, the mill became more than just a tool. It became a social center. Farmers gathered to wait their turn, exchanging news or gossip, while their grain was ground. Children watched curiously as the great sails turned high above, their wooden frames groaning as they caught the breeze. Even though the process was ordinary, it bound people together in the shared cycle of food production. Yet the windmill was also tied to authority, for most mills were owned by lords, monasteries, or wealthy patrons, and villagers paid for their use not with coins, but with a share of their grain. This small but constant tax reminded everyone that the benefits of technology often carried obligations. The wind itself might be free, but the mill was not, and so the turning sails became not only a symbol of productivity, but also a quiet reminder of hierarchy. Still, its value was undeniable. A single windmill could do the work of many households, freeing women from the endless toil of hand grinding and giving families more time for other labors. In this way, the windmill, though uncelebrated, reshaped daily life, shifting the balance of time and effort across entire regions. Over the years, designs continued to evolve. Stronger towers were built, sails were refined with cloth or slats to capture more wind, and gearing systems grew more sophisticated. Each improvement made the mill more reliable, yet none of these changes were celebrated in chronicles or poems. They were practical adjustments made quietly by craftsmen and millers, forgotten almost as soon as they became common. And yet, through these small, uneventful steps, the windmill grew into one of the most important tools of its age. Tonight, as you allow your thoughts to settle, picture one of these medieval windmills standing on a rise above a small village. The sails turn slowly in the evening breeze, the stones grind with steady patience, and the villagers collect their flour in silence. It is not a scene of grandeur or excitement, but one of calm necessity. And in that calm, the foundations of medieval life were built. The windmill's story, like the plow before it, is a story of uneventfulness, of quiet persistence, of history shaped not by spectacle, but by steady, ordinary labor repeated over centuries. By the 16th century, the windmill had become such an ordinary feature of the European countryside that its presence was almost invisible to those who lived beside it. Yet in its quiet way, it was transforming not just grain into flour, but the entire rhythm of medieval society as it slowly transitioned into the early modern world. The turning of the sails was a soundless clock for villages, marking not hours, but the dependable promise of food. Farmers brought grain, millers tended the gears, flour was bagged and carried away, and the cycle repeated without drama, season after season. Unlike the castles that crumbled with wars or the churches that changed with reform, the windmill remained steady, its uneventful labor giving people a sense of continuity. The machinery inside these structures had grown more sophisticated. Wooden cogs meshed with iron fittings, sails were fitted with shutters that could be adjusted to catch more or less wind, and millstones were carefully dressed to grind grain evenly without overheating. But the miller's job was still largely the same: to watch, to listen, to adjust, to keep the process moving at the pace the wind allowed. Too much wind and the sails spun dangerously fast. Too little and the stones slowed to silence. The work required vigilance, but it was rarely exciting. It was a craft of patience, a partnership with forces beyond human control, and one that defined daily life for communities across Europe. Around the base of the mill, life unfolded in small ways. Farmers exchanged gossip as they waited, children played in the dust, women discussed the price of bread or the state of their gardens. The mill was not only an economic center, but also a social one, a place where the repetition of work created space for human connection. And in that way, the uneventful turning of sails helped weave together the fabric of communities. Still, the windmill was more than just a village tool. It was also a symbol of control, for most mills were owned by lords, monasteries, or wealthy patrons. The right to build and operate a mill was often tightly regulated, and peasants were bound by custom to grind their grain there, paying a portion of their harvest as dues. This system reinforced hierarchies that had existed for centuries, reminding everyone that even the wind could be drawn into the structures of power. Yet despite these obligations, few would have chosen to do without the mill. The labor it saved was immense, freeing households from the endless grinding that had once consumed so much of their days. With more time available, families could turn their energy to weaving, dairying, building, or simply resting, and so the windmill quietly reshaped the balance of work and life. Its presence was not heroic, not dramatic, but deeply transformative. As evening fell, the sight of sails turning slowly against a fading sky was a reassurance to villagers that tomorrow's bread was secure. No chronicles praised the windmill, no poets immortalized its creaking gears, yet it was as essential to survival as the fields themselves. Tonight, as you drift into rest, imagine standing at the edge of a medieval village, the wind carrying the faint groan of wooden beams and the steady grind of stone upon stone. Picture the miller moving calmly among the gears, the farmers waiting with their sacks, the sails sweeping against the horizon. It is a scene of quiet persistence, uneventful and steady, and it is in that very uneventfulness that the windmill's importance lies. By the 17th century, the windmill had become so deeply woven into the fabric of European life that it no longer seemed like an invention at all, but a natural extension of the landscape, as ordinary as fields of wheat or rivers winding through valleys. Its sails turned slowly against skies that carried the moods of the seasons, catching breezes in spring, whirling fiercely in autumn storms, or standing still under the weight of summer heat. Generations of villagers had grown up in their shadows, and for them the windmill was not a marvel but a fact of life, a dependable partner in the quiet work of survival. Yet beneath that ordinariness, the windmill had steadily expanded human possibilities. By transforming the endless labor of grinding into a task powered by air, it freed communities to direct their energy elsewhere. Time once consumed by hand mills could now be spent on crafts, trade, and family. In this way, the uneventful turning of sails shaped villages into towns, and towns into thriving centers of culture. Still, the daily rhythm of the mill remained humble. Grain was hoisted, stones ground, flour fell into sacks, and villagers carried it home. The process was the same year after year, and though small refinements were made, better gears, stronger sails, sturdier towers, the essential act remained unchanged. The miller's job was never glamorous, but it was indispensable. He listened for the hum of the stones, felt for the right texture of flour, and adjusted the sails to match the wind. Too strong a gust and the machinery risked damage. Too weak and work came to a halt. The miller lived by patience, never commanding the wind, but always negotiating with it. For the wider community, the windmill was more than machinery. It was a place of gathering, where farmers met while waiting their turn, where children played in the dust, where the quiet monotony of grinding created space for stories, news, and laughter. The mill was both economic and social, binding people together in its uneventful rhythm. But it was also tied to structures of power. The right to operate mills often belonged to lords or monasteries, and villagers paid their share in grain for the privilege of using them. Thus the windmill, though humble, was also a reminder of obligation, showing how even the breeze itself could be drawn into the web of authority. Yet for all that, its benefits were undeniable. Bread was more plentiful, time was more flexible, and survival was more secure. And so the sails kept turning, uneventful yet essential, generation after generation. To a traveler crossing the plains of the Low Countries or the rolling hills of England, the sight of windmills punctuating the horizon was a reassurance that life was stable here, that communities had found a way to harness nature's most fleeting gift. And though poets rarely sang of them, the steady groan of their gears was as vital to civilization as any king's decree or knight's sword. Tonight, as you let yourself sink into rest, picture a line of windmills standing quietly in the twilight, their sails turning slowly as the last light fades. Hear the faint creak of wood, the grind of stone, the hush of flour falling into sacks. It is not a story of battles or glory, but of patience, persistence, and the uneventful labor that carried countless generations through the uncertainties of life. As the 17th and 18th centuries unfolded, the windmill continued to stand as a quiet companion to European life, not celebrated in chronicles or carved into monuments, but present in the daily routines of countless villages. Its sails, weathered by rain and sun, turned with the invisible power of the wind, grinding grain with the same slow patience that had guided communities for centuries. To most people, it was so familiar that it no longer drew attention. Yet without it, bread would have been scarce, markets would have faltered, and households would have been forced back into exhausting manual labor. The windmill was a reminder that progress did not always arrive with fanfare, but often with uneventful persistence. By this time, improvements in design had spread widely. Tower mills dominated much of the landscape, their stone or brick walls standing firmly against storms, while their rotating caps allowed sails to be angled toward the shifting winds. Millers had developed more precise gearing, allowing them to adjust speeds, grind different types of grain, and even manage multiple sets of stones. Some mills began to serve more than one purpose, pressing seeds for oil or cutting timber, but their central role remained the grinding of grain into flour. It was not spectacular, but it was essential. Inside the mill, the atmosphere was the same as it had been for centuries. Wooden cogs meshed with iron, millstones rumbled, and flour dust drifted like a pale mist, settling on clothes and beams alike. The miller's hands were always busy, feeling the grind, listening for imbalance, tightening ropes, or repairing sails. His work demanded constant attention, but it brought little glory, and perhaps that is why stories often painted millers as cunning or miserly. Yet behind those stereotypes was a truth. Millers carried the quiet responsibility of feeding entire communities. Without them, the sails would be useless and the stones silent. Around the base of the mill, villagers continued their routines. Farmers delivered sacks of grain, waited as they were measured, and collected flour in return, paying their share as custom demanded. Children watched curiously, fascinated by the slow movement of the sails and the mysterious groans of the machinery. For them, the mill was both ordinary and magical, a place where invisible wind became tangible food. For adults, it was simply a necessity, a link in the chain of survival. The windmill was also a lesson in humility. It relied on forces that could not be commanded. Calm days brought silence. Fierce storms brought danger. A miller might prepare, adjust, or repair, but he could never control the wind itself. This dependence made the mill a symbol of humanity's limited mastery over nature, capable of harnessing but never fully ruling it. In that way, the uneventful turning of sails carried a deeper message about life itself: steady work, patience, and acceptance of limits. Tonight, as you drift deeper into calm, imagine a hilltop with a windmill turning slowly in the evening breeze. The air hums with the steady rhythm of grinding, the sky glows with fading light, and villagers gather their flour in silence. There is no spectacle here, no grand event, only the ordinary persistence that sustains life. And in that ordinariness lies the true power of the windmill, for it reminds us that history is built not only on moments of glory, but on the uneventful labor that endures through generations. By the 18th century, the windmill had become such a constant part of European life that its quiet presence seemed eternal, as though it had always stood on the hillsides and plains, turning steadily with the breeze. In truth, it was the result of centuries of refinement, of countless nameless millers adjusting gears, replacing sails, and repairing stones. But by now those labors had faded into the background of daily existence. Villages looked to their mills with neither awe nor surprise, but with steady reliance, for without the mill, the most basic rhythm of life, turning grain into bread, would falter. The sails creaked, the gears groaned, and flour dust filled the air, and all of this uneventful repetition formed the unseen backbone of survival. Inside the tower mills, the machinery had grown more sophisticated. Adjustable sails with shutters allowed millers to control speed more carefully, reducing the risk of damage during strong winds. Iron replaced wood in critical gears, making the grinding more durable and efficient. Some mills operated multiple sets of stones, grinding different grains at once, while others expanded to crush seeds for oil, or even to power small workshops. Still, the central purpose remained unchanged: to harness the invisible power of the wind and relieve people of the endless toil of hand grinding. The villagers who brought their grain rarely thought about the engineering within. They simply knew that flour would come out ready to be baked into bread, the food that sustained every family. Around these mills, communities continued to gather. Farmers queued with their carts, gossip flowed, and deals were made while they waited. The mill had become a place not only of work, but of social connection, a hub where daily life intersected with the slow, steady rhythm of the turning sails. To children, the structure was still a source of wonder, with its massive arms sweeping across the sky. But to adults, it was just another part of the dependable routine. Yet even as windmills spread, they also revealed the limits of human ingenuity. The wind could not always be counted upon. Long, still days brought silence, while storms threatened to tear sails apart. A miller might prepare carefully, adjusting shutters and gears, but he could not dictate the weather. This dependence on nature's unpredictability was humbling, reminding entire communities that survival rested not only on human effort, but on forces beyond their control. In this way, the windmill was both a triumph and a lesson. It showed that people could harness the elements, but also that they must live within the boundaries of what the natural world allowed. Across Europe, from the Low Countries to Spain, from England to the plains of Germany, windmills became so numerous that they defined the landscape. Travelers noted them as markers on their journeys, rising above the fields like quiet guardians of the countryside. They were not grand monuments, nor the subject of epics, yet they carried a quiet dignity in their steady persistence. Tonight, as you let your thoughts settle into stillness, picture one of those landscapes dotted with windmills. each one turning slowly in the fading light of day. The sound of grinding carries faintly across the fields. The smell of flour lingers in the air, and villagers move calmly about their work. It is uneventful, it is ordinary, and yet it is this very ordinariness that built the foundation of life in medieval Europe. The windmill did not change history in a single moment. It shaped it through centuries of quiet, persistent labor, a reminder that progress is often made not in leaps, but in slow, turning circles. By the close of the medieval period and into the dawn of the modern age, the windmill had already established itself as one of the most enduring and uneventful companions of European life. It did not arrive with thunderous innovation, nor did it leave monuments or ballads in its honor, yet its presence marked every loaf of bread, every marketplace transaction, and every meal shared at a wooden table. For centuries, its sails had turned with the breeze, grinding grain into flour with patience and persistence. And in that uneventful rhythm, entire generations had found stability. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the design of windmills continued to refine itself. Millwrights, those craftsmen who built and repaired mills, introduced clever adjustments, smarter gearing, stronger sails, and innovations like fantails, small vanes that automatically turned the cap to face the wind. Each improvement made the mill more efficient, but none of them transformed the essential experience. Inside, the steady groan of wooden cogs and the grinding of stone upon stone remained unchanged, a soundscape as familiar to villagers as the ringing of church bells. The work of the miller remained a craft of vigilance. He watched the sky for signs of wind, adjusted the shutters when breezes grew too strong, and listened constantly to the stones, trained to hear the difference between good grinding and dangerous friction. His labor was not glamorous but essential, and though stories sometimes cast millers as sly or selfish, in truth, they carried a burden of responsibility. Without their careful tending, the sails would stand still, and the community would hunger. Beyond the mechanics, the windmill carried symbolic weight as well. It represented humanity's ability to live with nature, rather than against it, to find ways to harness invisible forces without destroying them. The windmill could never command the breeze. It could only wait, adapt, and work with what was given. This humility was part of its lesson, a quiet reminder that human progress often depends on patience, on persistence, and on acceptance of limits. By the time industrial power began to rise, windmills started to fade into the background of history, gradually replaced by steam engines and modern machinery. Yet even as their practical importance declined, their image endured. They became part of the cultural memory of Europe, appearing in paintings, in tales, and in the landscapes of writers who saw in them a symbol of calm endurance. The uneventful turning of sails became not just a memory of work, but of a way of life, rooted in simplicity and stability. And so, the story of the windmill, like that of the plow before it, closes not with excitement but with quiet reflection. It is a story of ordinary labor, repeated endlessly, shaping lives without ever demanding attention. Its uneventful history is a reminder that civilization rests not only on moments of brilliance or conquest, but on the steady, unnoticed persistence of tools that make survival possible. Tonight, as you let your eyes grow heavy and your breath deepen, imagine once more a line of windmills standing in the twilight, their sails moving slowly, their stones grinding steadily, the faint hum of flour dust in the air. It is not dramatic, it is not heroic, but it is enduring. The uneventful story of the windmill is the story of patience, of quiet strength, and of the gentle turning of time itself. And before you drift fully into sleep, remember to treat your body and mind with kindness. Avoid going to bed too full. Let your eyes rest from the bright screens of phones and tablets, and allow yourself to let go of the weight of the day. A calm night prepares you for a calmer tomorrow. Thank you for spending this quiet time here. Sleep well, and I'll see you again tomorrow night at Sleep Whisper.